Hello, Andrew Colsky with Therapy BTS, Therapy Behind the Scenes. And today we are privileged to talk with Laelle Novotny, who is a neuroscience and psychology dual degree student. She is someone who has been living with OCD, and she has a really interesting story to tell about how she's worked with OCD and lived with OCD. So, Laelle, welcome. Could you introduce yourself in a little bit more depth to the audience?
Yes, I'm Laelle Novotny. I am currently an undergraduate student in my last year in St. Louis. Obviously, I've dealt with OCD. A big part of why I went into neuroscience and psychology is because of my personal experience with OCD and then what I have learned along the way through therapy, kind of gaining greater knowledge about what I'm facing. Yeah.
Great, great. Well, I have a lot of questions for you.
Okay.
So my audience knows that I spend a lot of time treating OCD.
hmm
And one of the things that I say often is it's not scientifically proven, but my experience is I tend to have two types of clients. I tend to
hmm
have those clients who can remember back as a kid, they've always had some sort of obsessive thoughts and compulsions. And then I have people who don't have that history, but maybe they've had some sort of a traumatic experience, and as a result, they end up with some sort of OCD. And you fall into the former category. So tell us, how far back can you remember that you've had anything that you now know would have been OCD?
so really can't even pinpoint how young of an age I was, but even playing, like my first experience with playing with other children, I can remember like my idea of playing was setting things up perfectly. Like I would have Legos and things like that as a kid, and I would build them and I would perfectly place everything and then leave it and get extremely upset if anyone moved anything. Um, so that is something like anyone can report about that. They were like, my child is not playing with their toys. Like you can give them a race car and they will set it up on a track and leave it. So I can remember like small instances of that. Um, but I guess the first like big red flag for me and also my family had to do with a development of a severe fear of vomiting. Um, so emetophobia. I was in a class, and this obviously, I don't know, I have multiple traumatic experiences. I cannot tell you if it was traumatic to me at the time or if it became traumatic after the development of my obsessions and compulsions tied to it. But like I remember kids would vomit in class,
Mm.
and I just remember that being super traumatic in me, like beginning to, I guess, form this like deep anxiety around it before I was even giving into compulsions. I was going through these like kind of mental checking things, like how close was I to this person? Is this person going to go to school tomorrow? I have to make sure I don't stand by them in line. And then obviously as I grew, that developed into a bigger thing. And then I also had a lot of separation anxiety as a child.
Hmm.
This is the earliest one I can remember that was like very clinical OCD like experience I had was my mom was leaving for Chicago and I was like, before you leave, like I think something's gonna happen to you if you don't write on both my hands like perfectly. Um, and text me. This was obviously through my dad's phone. I was maybe 5 or 6 at the time. Um, like every day. And then that was like an extremely stressful period. Like I remember I would be at a I was playing soccer at the time, so I was at indoor soccer games and I'd like come off the bench and ask my dad, like, did has mom texted? Has mom texted? And I don't remember it being linked to like, oh, like she's gonna die or something like that, as it has grown into.
Hmm.
But I do remember it being like extremely anxiety inducing. And then immediately relieved temporarily when she would text me. And then when she came back, that continued. So it was like every day when I went to school, I had to do these rituals. So those are really early, I guess, examples.
So this is all like elementary school stuff still, right?
Yeah. My first, so like first grade, I would pretty much have a tantrum going into class every time because I had such severe, and it was just separation anxiety at the time is what they gave it, which we now know OCD latches onto things you care about. So it's gonna manifest in like what could be normal behaviors becoming maladaptive.
Hmm.
So my parents, things that I was attached to. Um, so yeah, that like first grade, every single day I walked in, it was a mess. Like my mom would have to go in with me. I would throw a tantrum. She would have to kind of slowly get me distracted and then walk away, and I'd be fine the rest of the day. But that's as early as I can remember it.
Wow. All right. So here we are. We're only at first grade, but you've mentioned a lot of things that I would have to assume your parents were looking at and probably asking themselves, is this what we should be expecting, or is something going on? What, I mean, obviously you were very young, so you may not know, but did your
Yeah.
parents ever share with you what they thought back then?
Um, yeah, so it was like very clear this was a big issue because it would happen at home as well with random things. I was pretty defiant because things made me uncomfortable. And so they took me in first. So my mom is a speech pathologist, so she works with a lot of children diagnosed with autism
Hmm.
and other learning disabilities. And I had a pretty high IQ. I didn't take an actual IQ test, but just my learning ability and my application ability was a way ahead of its time. So it was immediately suspected that it was autism. So they kind of watched. We went because I was the main thing that was leading into that was I wasn't able to play with other children the way they were playing because I was
Hmm.
setting things up and getting extremely upset when it would not go my way.
Right.
Um, so I didn't go and get a formal diagnosis of this, but eventually, actually pretty early, like it's end of my first grade year when it just got to be horrible. I was doing great in school, but socially, like horrible. So I went to see just a basic psychologist through my, I guess, primary care provider. And immediately they were like, this is not autism, this is oppositional defiance disorder.
Mm.
Um, so I got that diagnosis. And I went on, I have no idea what type of medication I went on, but I went immediately on medication and then into a family therapy treatment with my whole family. And that was horrible. I retaliated a lot whenever I would have to go to those sessions. Um, the medication was not working. It was actually increasing the symptoms and causing other symptoms, including vomiting and stomach issues,
Oh boy.
which were not, yeah, which were just fueling the fire.
Hmm.
And then eventually my parents were like, this family therapy is great. Like it's working for us. And I was doing everything in it. That's the other thing. Like I was on a reward system. So I was so young and it was like, oh, if you don't throw a temper tantrum today, like you can get ice cream tomorrow. And I would do it. And it just did not work for like months and months and months. And they're like, I don't think this is what it is. So I went back. They were like, oh, could be some part of our development. Some children just have a worse childhood. They looked into childhood trauma. I had had no particular childhood trauma that would point me in this direction. I actually had a really secure attachment with both my parents. They had good parenting styles, so it just wasn't easy to pinpoint. Finally, my mom started doing some research on some of my more odd behaviors
Hmm.
and was like, could this be OCD? Just randomly. And we went to a specialist and they were like, yes, this is a very early presentation of OCD, one of the earliest and most severe cases I've seen, just because of all that it had already latched onto. Um, but yeah, so that's where I got my diagnosis. I don't remember the exact age, but yeah.
Wow. All right. So wait, I want to make sure I get this right. So first you told us that way back when you were dealing with emetophobia. And
hmm
I'm curious, did that sort of dissipate on its own or did it stay with you? I kind of want to follow through what happened here.
Yeah. So after I kind of outgrew the separation anxiety, which there was OCD tendencies attached to, but a lot of that was just my regular development. The emetophobia became my primary like issue. Like I would not go to class if someone had been sick in the last week. I would wash my hands till they were raw. I was doing it, giving into these compulsions that were extreme at this point. Um, and no, that did not go away on its own. In fact, I still have a little bit of that to this day. But I went into an exposure therapy program um, after trying a couple different just cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, mindfulness, things like that, different therapeutic techniques. I went into a strict, rigorous exposure therapy treatment plan where I was daily getting exposed to vomit and all things vomit. And
Oh,
it was horrible at the beginning.
pleasant.
I responded very fast and started showing a lot of reduction in the compulsions at least. Um, Obviously the obsessions didn't go away, but eventually those lessened as well. But I worked on that for 3 years and then went into kind of this remission period, went out of it, and then worked on it again for another 2 years.
So when you were doing that program that you were just describing, was that still
Mhm.
elementary school age or how old were you?
Um, I started, yes, I would say fourth grade, I
Oh,
believe
wow.
is when I started. And then I found a really good therapist. I'd tried so many at this point. And I also had met with a psychiatrist that understood OCD very well and had done a lot of research on medications for that because there isn't one tried and true medication that works, and
Right.
that's any mental health. But I finally got that regulated and then started, yes, that exposure therapy around fourth grade. It followed me all the way through high school and then even a little bit into college on a as needed base.
Hmm. Well, so let's talk about elementary school for a second
Mhm,
before you got the diagnosis.
mhm,
So here you are, this very young kid going into elementary school, resisting certain things because of your, your obsessions.
mhm.
And how did your teachers react to you?
Um, so in the class, that was the thing. I was at a point where I had started developing socially when this emetophobia developed to where I could kind of hide it. But there were still signs like in class, if somebody vomited, I would freak out, but it was more of a behind the scenes thing. Like I'd have kind of a silent panic attack. I'd pace, I'd have these physiological symptoms, but I don't think I had teachers that like noticed that, but my parents talked to them about it because I was missing a lot of school and I would go to the nurse a lot, which is ironic because that's where a lot of the traumatic experiences came from was I would go
Right.
to the nurse and there'd be people sick in there. Um, but yeah, I they noticed also like the big indicator was my hands were absolutely raw. Like I used so much hand sanitizer. I actually had like a whole thing in my backpack and one in my desk. So that was like obvious. And like my hands would bleed and I would constantly ask for band-aids. Like that was a big indicator. So, and I was just very odd because my mind was always involved in some sort of obsessional thought.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I couldn't give into a compulsion because I was actively engaging in class, it was like very clear that I was like distant, like somewhere else with my thoughts. So
Wow.
yeah.
I mean, this is, one of the issues that we see, which is unfortunate, is so you were fortunate from the standpoint that your mom understood what was going on and was able to educate your teachers. The
Hmm.
difficult, the unfortunate cases are the kids who have OCD. They're in elementary school per se. Their teachers don't know because the parents don't know. And now the teachers treating the kid as if they're a discipline problem, which then
Yeah,
can exacerbate their symptoms because of, whatever their obsessive thoughts might be.
yeah.
And the poor kid can't do anything about it and they feel trapped, and the parents aren't helping. Parents maybe even are punishing them for not,
Mhm.
complying with the teacher. And it's because we don't have enough OCD awareness.
Well, even with that, was still, I was on a behavioral plan from like first grade when we thought this was oppositional defiance disorder. Because at this point, I was unpredictable. Who know? I never once, obviously, involved other children in like my defiance. It was never like that. But like, who's to know when you're that young? So I met with like the school psychologist, and I remember sitting in her office really frustrated that I was missing out on class and sitting there like trying to explain to her like I don't have a problem with like getting along with kids. And I didn't have an interest in making friends. So everyone was like, why aren't you trying to make friends? Well, my back of my mind is I don't want friends because if my friend gets sick, I'm gonna get like it was to that point where I had really thought out like what I'm gonna do to not vomit ever. So and
Wow.
that was just really hard for anyone to understand. And they were looking for this underlying thing, like, what else is going on? Even after being told it's OCD, it's OCD, it's OCD. And they're not seeing these outright compulsions in class, which are what is portrayed in movies and media, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Um, so they're like, this isn't OCD. But yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So, all right. So then you get to the first person that actually diagnoses you with OCD.
Mhm.
And what did that person do in terms of treatment?
They suggested, they were like, immediately get out of this therapy you're in, this family therapy, because that's a waste of time and money. And it's actually just going to continue to frustrate her because these things that she's doing that are supposedly working and everyone's encouraging her, if you do this, it'll work. It's not working.
Mhm.
So they went through, obviously, first and foremost, getting on the right medication. I went on a medication that worked, and then they were like, they kind of referred me in network to a bunch of therapists. None of them, that's another thing. With lack of awareness, there's a lack of resources available.
Yep.
Um, Went through this whole cycle of therapists, even ones that were like, oh yeah, I study OCD. Um, I know a lot about OCD, and it wasn't the right treatment for me at all. And I really can't tell you how that, maybe when you're older and you're very self-aware, but I don't think that just sit down therapy could ever help someone with severe OCD. In fact, it actually makes it worse because it just puts you into a spiral.
Yeah.
And then again, it was my family doing research on just these new types of therapy and being like, this sounds terrible, but we're kind of out of options. And this was a point I wasn't going to class. I was not doing well mentally. Let's try this exposure therapy. And we went to one of my therapists who even was like, Laelle's doing everything, but nothing's changing. And she was like, I know of someone you can try. We went in and immediately that was completely different for me, but started working.
So when you started exposure therapy,
Mhm.
what were the obsessive thoughts that you were dealing with at that time?
At that time, it was a mix of things. It was a lot about the emetophobia, um, and it had gotten to the point where I'd have like number systems. Like if I write the number 9 down on a piece of paper, I'm going to vomit. If I don't step right, I'm going to vomit. If I don't organize my room tonight, I'm going to vomit. So it was around everything. But it involved, there's these subtypes of OCD, which also people don't know about, but it involved all sorts of these different categories of obsessions and compulsions, like this pure OCD, like organization style. If you don't do this, you'll vomit. Um, and then like also just like thought stuff, harm OCD, all sorts of things like that. And then we started grinding on that really hard. And then it kind of uncoupled from the fear of vomiting. And
Hmm.
that's when I was like certain I had OCD because at that point I had read kind of these books tailored to children about it, that my mom had found and tried to get as many resources as I could myself about it because I was so frustrated with it at this point. And I was kind of like, see, guys, I don't have, like, I'm not defiant. Like, I'm just really uncomfortable. I don't know how to explain it. Um, and at that point, I started not having this fear of vomiting, but was still having OCD tendencies that were just like, you have to do it just because. You have to do this now just because. So that's when I was like, okay, like now I'm on the right path with my treatment at least.
Hmm. And,
Yeah.
and, and about how old are you at this particular point in time?
I want to say I was like, this lasted from like age 8 till age 12.
Okay. And so you're doing exposure therapy. Did you feel at the time that you were getting any benefit from it?
No. In fact, I mean, yes, after 3 to 5 sessions. So yes, immediately, but when I went into it and every time I was doing active exposures and exposure therapy, absolutely not. Like I remember sitting there like this is absolute torture. I am watching videos of people vomiting here. I'm going around and touching doorknobs. I go home and I can only wash my hands X amount of times a day. I'm not allowed to do these things that my brain is telling me to do. So it's extremely uncomfortable. And I think that's the biggest thing is if you're not feeling uncomfortable, the treatment is not working. And
Right.
that's where you have to be honest in a therapy setting with what is actually bothering you. Because I could go in and be like, yeah, like I have a problem with this and this and this, and they can give you these exposures to work on. But if they aren't really that uncomfortable to you, you're not defeating anything. Um, and that's also the hardest thing with if you're actually going to give exposure therapy. How do you deal with that in such a young child?
Yeah. See, we talk about the fact that, maybe a lot of therapists are not trained in OCD. And
Mhm.
then those even those who may know about OCD, if they know about exposure and response prevention, a lot of them can be skeptical because they fear the concept of having to expose someone to something that
Yeah.
makes them feel distressed.
Well, yeah, and it's traumatic. Like I would sit there and cry and scream and just freeze up, and that's like a human reaction because it is a physiological fear response that's happening for me.
Hmm.
Um, and that's like the hardest part to understand about exposure therapy is you're literally doing. I have this thing, it's like mind over matter. This was what one of my first therapists told me to try to describe OCD. The mind over matter is what we think about. Like, oh, you can put your mind to, you can do anything. But it's when it comes to exposure therapy, it's matter over mind actually, because your mind is telling you to do one thing, but at a normal baseline rate, that's not what anyone else would do. So the matter is before the mind. And that's like the first thing that I kind of think of when trying to describe OCD to someone and how the treatment actually works.
Right, right. So, okay, so by this point, you've seen several different therapists, you've tried different medications, you now are finally doing exposure therapy. You're still young in elementary school. So,
Mhm.
what happens? What happens next?
So I eventually got to a point where I was doing a lot better. Um, I was not having active compulsions happen, and I was self-managing my exposures that I would do. So it got to the point where therapy was no longer doing active exposures, but it was talking and how can I deal with new compulsions that are come up? Because I would have a obsession about something. I'd deal with all the compulsions through doing exposures, and then it would move to something else. So how am I going to deal with it? And it became really easy to identify by myself like what to do, because it's hard to actually do it, but it's easy to know what you have to do.
Hmm.
You literally do exactly the opposite, or to a lessened extent at first, of what your mind is telling you to do when you're in this anxious spiral.
Right.
Um, and then I weaned off of therapy for a little bit, and then I've had to go back like since, whether it's just for quick check-ins or like actively working on exposures again.
Hmm.
Um, in, in high school, for example, this emetophobia had not, this isn't a thing that I like deal with every day. Like it's there, and sometimes it'll get triggered by different things, but it's kind of within a normal rate now. I'm just like, oh, it's a fear. Like anyone has a fear of spiders, anyone has a fear of this. It's more like that.
Hmm.
Um, but I had OCD in high school pretty bad when it came to like body dysmorphia things. So like these were compulsions that I couldn't actively act out, but I had it surrounding my teeth and how they appeared. And I was like, I have to get all these surgeries to fix it. And that's where it got really dangerous, because that can grow into eating disorder realm, um, severe like self-harm realm. And that is when I really understood what I was dealing with. I had actively engaged in therapy, so I went back and did exposures with that kind of stuff. And because I had practiced it so much, I didn't find it extremely difficult
Hmm.
the second time. But I did have to go back for 2 years in high school pretty consistently.
Okay.
So,
But you went back, you did exposure therapy again, and you found it to help you.
oh, absolutely. I think every time I've done a string of even 5 exposure therapies that are intense, good, even just an hour of just strict work on it that really, really sucks at the time, I will feel in like intense relief, and that lasts for a long time. And this isn't like the relief you feel when you give into a compulsion and then it comes back the next time you look at something. Um, this is like you feel like you're actively able to, it's almost like you're unable to regulate your emotions. And in order to do that, you have to do something. And then you grow to this point after doing so much exposure therapy that you can actively regulate your emotions just by doing what else would do, instead of giving into these things that are actually making the disorder worse.
Hmm.
But yeah, I have had periods of time that are like complete remission periods. I do not think it would meet the criteria of having a DSM diagnosis of OCD, which I obviously do.
Hmm.
But it was at a severe point where it's like hospitalization was my only choice a couple times. And then with exposure response prevention coupled with the right medications and just people that know what they're doing ultimately, um it's gone to normal. Like you ask anyone that hasn't talked to me about it, I don't think they would be able to identify that I have OCD today.
Wow. So
Yeah.
so let me ask you about high school then. So
Hmm.
you're in high school, you're going through exposure therapy, you're dealing with some obsessive thoughts. Did any of that impact your social life?
Yes, but more on a mental, like, okay, I'll explain it. So I had plenty of friends. I found a way around my OCD to be able to make friends by doing therapy so early.
Hmm.
But when it came to friends, OCD tends to put these standards on everything, these perfectionist standards. So I would start to obsess over if my friends liked me or not, how I was appearing to them. So for me, yes, socially, I felt that I was like somehow failing. Not only that, but to be told at a young age, like she's not socially like there. Like she
Hmm.
just, so that also, there was a label behind that. Um, but like looking back, no, it didn't actually physically impact me socially, but like how it felt to me, yes. And it's like OCD with anything else. Like I'm sure like somebody could ask like, "Oh, did you get sick more because you had OCD and you had a fear of vomiting?" I would say yes, like it happened all the time, but no, it was anxiety that made it feel like that. So it was the OCD itself that makes it feel so horrible and like it's the end of the world, but it's really not. Like I would not get invited to things once and freak out about it. And the only way it did impact me socially was when I would start to reach out to people about it and they're like, "What? Like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not the reality. Like, we like you. We don't know." Like, and I would even use my diagnosis like it's because I have OCD that people are acting this way. They don't want to hang out with me. And that's just pure stigma. That's unfortunately what our society has done and what lack of knowledge has done. But also worked on that in therapy, as well as gaining confidence about talking about what I have
Hmm.
and not having it be this like I say it's not something I suffer from. Like it's just something that's a part of me. And if you can channel it into the right things, it can actually have somewhat of a benefit if you really learn how to control it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah.
So I understand what you're saying, and you're saying that now at this age, but the high school you, did the high
Hmm.
school you disclose anything to your friends about your OCD?
Yes, because there were times when it would get triggered and I was very obviously like deviating from a norm of what anyone else would do in a situation. Like if someone would vomit, that would still come up on occasion. Or um like I would be asking reassurance questions about my appearance constantly and they're like, "We answered this. Like what is going on?" And it would get to the point where they'd be like, "This is really annoying. Why are you doing this?" And I disclose that. But that's also what kind of helped me build confidence was being able to disclose that. But unfortunately, it made me realize people have no idea what this is,
Hmm.
at all. Like, there's some people that are genuinely interested and will be like, wait, explain that. That doesn't make sense. And I will, but it's just impossible to explain to someone that doesn't face it, especially when I'm like not I'm studying it now. So I understand it more and it helps to have a lot of personal experience. Like I can't imagine what it'd be like me trying to understand um someone else who's telling me this and I've never experienced it.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's it's kind of a double-edged sword. Like sometimes it's nice that people don't know um that it's so prevalent, but then it really can get annoying and um hurt pretty bad when it's overlooked or even just like people I think my pet peeve is when people come, "You have OCD, that must be so nice." Like you
Really?
must be so oh you must be so organized. You
Oh,
must be so clean. Everything must be perfect. That's why you get such good grades. I'm like, no. And the thing that I'll bring up is they did statistics. This was like back in 2020, but like most reported debilitating mental illness and illness combined. Um, I don't know what methods they used, but it was published and OCD was like in the top 10, and that's with like cancers and liver failure. And that's how debilitating it is. And people, or when people are like, oh, like I'm so OCD about this.
right.
It just shows how we are very unaware of this.
Yeah, they have no idea what OCD actually is
Yeah,
when they say that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So did you ever find yourself in, again, let's talk about high school. Uh,
Hmm.
Was there ever a case in high school where you disclosed your OCD to one of your friends and you got a negative reaction?
Um, Not particularly in high school because that's still when I wasn't super confident with it and was still learning about it myself. But it has happened quite a bit in college. Um, I did have it in high school where I disclosed it to even family members, more distant family members, and not necessarily a negative reaction, but you can tell they like categorize me of being this like black sheep of the family.
Oh, wow.
Like like I remember, oh, I actually do remember. I was in like a family reunion and one of my really, really young cousins came up to me and they were like, "Oh, my mom said you or your sister has a mental illness." And I was just like, "Oh yeah, like I have OCD." And they're like, "Oh, so are you weird?" Or something that somebody very young that didn't understand it meant. And I'm like, so my own family members are like saying something to their children, which not their fault, they don't know. But I don't know, I had those here and there, but it didn't bother me.
Hmm.
And then in college, that's when I was like, these people are even more educated. We're all adults now, and nobody knows what is going on, what this is. Um, which I can go into more, but
Well,
yeah.
so by time you graduate high school, it sounds
Hmm.
like things had kind of calmed down again because you had been in treatment.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so you get out, you graduate, things are going okay. You get into college, which is stressful for everybody trying to get into college.
Yeah.
Start college, and then what happens?
Yeah. So going into college, I had grown to a point where I was in this kind of remission period of OCD. It wasn't constantly there, but it was still there. It's always there. Um, but wasn't actively in therapy, unless I needed it to check in, was a pretty normal person going into college.
Hmm.
But my goal was like, I'm not gonna hide this. This is a part of me. Not only this, but I'm going out of state for college. I want to be successful here, and I'm not gonna let this get in the way of my life like it has in the past. Um, so I went to college. I that's my
Oh,
dog. Quickly, I'm gonna pull her out of my room. You might have to edit this part out, but come
sure.
here. Uh-uh. Let's go. Okay.
So you go to college, you're gonna
Mhm.
not hide it anymore.
Yeah. And then I went and I was in a dorm with some people and they were very open about talking about their own things they were facing, depression, just stress that they were facing going into college. And we were talking, and this was like freshman year. This is a little bit in. I wasn't just like, "Hey guys, like I have OCD." But I began kind of building good relationships with people, and then I'd start to tell them, and everyone was like baffled when I would like try to explain it. Like, and this felt more negative to me. Like I would, to my closest friends at the time, like tell them, yeah, like I can't go out tonight because I'm having a rough day with OCD. Like this was when compulsions would get bad and I'd really have to hammer in on doing different exposures or else I knew it would get out of hand. And they would basically be like, "Oh, you're using this," or they would take it as something like harmful. So I was dealing with harm OCD at a little bit at this time. So harm OCD, sexual OCD was also something I crossed into, unfortunately. So I'd have these really, really overwhelming thoughts, and the compulsions were more mental. And I also was like, I have to tell somebody about these, was another compulsion I had. So I would begin to talk about it, and immediately they were like, this person is crazy, like you're psychotic. I got called, like genuinely called different things. So that's when I was like,
Oh,
wow.
these are from
And
college educated people.
friends, yeah,
Wow.
most of them in my in my program or have some background on a lot of this, and also some of them facing their own issues. And that, I think the worst part is OCD is ego dystonic. So it latches on to your morality and exactly who you are and develops these fears about exactly who you don't want to be. And then when you try to explain that to somebody, they like think like if I have sexual OCD, they're automatically like they're perverted. Or if I have harm OCD, like they're gonna hurt someone or themselves. And that just reinforces the OCD by, oh, now it's true. Like other people think that, so now it's true.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so that was definitely a lot of negative experience with that. And then it happened in through college. I've had different bouts of it, have had to go back to therapy, um, medication adjustments just because that happens. But I've talked to different offices um at our university, just wider offices, about what I'm facing, about how they can accommodate me when I'm having rough times. And they very blatantly don't understand it either.
Yeah.
Counseling centers don't understand it, unfortunately. You tell them you're having an intrusive thought and it's OCD. Make that very clear. This is not what is actually going to happen. This is what I'm dealing with. And they freak out and they move it on to a different office, someone who they think knows, and then they don't know, so they move it on to a different office.
Yeah.
And with other people, it's a very small, I guess, group I have of other people that have OCD, and they've had, unfortunately, some of the exact same experiences.
Yeah, I mean, the
Yeah.
thing you're describing, it's sort of this double-edged sword because you've got people getting trained in mental health. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, one of the things they get trained in, for example, is suicidality. And then we have
Yes.
all these programs to teach people about suicide prevention. And we have the
Mm-hmm.
suicide hotline and all this stuff. And there's a lot of news media and a lot of attention about suicide. So now you've got all the mental health professionals, the first responders, the police, everybody really hypersensitive about that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And you get someone with OCD who might express harm OCD or something, which means
Mm-hmm.
they would never do it. They have a thought, but they would never act on it. But
Yes.
these folks are not trained in OCD, so they go right to, oh my God, red flag, suicide, suicide.
Yes.
And they overreact because they're reacting to the wrong thing. Now, they don't know,
Yes.
they think they're reacting to the right thing. And so, like you say, they become afraid. I've got to report this. I've got to tell
Yes.
somebody, and it blows it up.
Exactly. Well, and it makes it worse on the person who's dealing with the OCD because that is going to add into their obsession. Absolutely. I've had um kind of things with my sexual OCD. I've opened up about it and people have been like, "Oh my gosh, like is she going to harm someone else or herself? Like what's going on?" And harm OCD. Those fell pretty hand in hand with me. Um and then just the people being freaked out about it and what I was going to do just fed it. Like, because OCD is all about finding proof for something, having certainty. So that was like what my brain took, unfortunately. And it was like, okay, so you are actually like this. This means you are going to do that. You are going to act upon it. And here's a bunch of more compulsions you have to do. So you don't.
Yeah,
And the thing that does is it just puts them in the dark more the more they give in to that, because it's true, like depression rates are rampant right now. Our generation, that's a struggle we've had. I know at our university, they constantly are pushing these mental health resources, which are great. But for me, when I'm facing this and it's very specific and needs very specific treatment, and not only that, but I'm very self-aware about what I need and when I need it, and I can go into an office and say, I have OCD. This is how I treat it. I just need to talk through this, whatever. When they hear it, it's like immediate into they have a mental health diagnosis. We don't know if what they're saying is true. So there is still stigma around that. That makes it worse as well.
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
like if they're saying this and they're saying it's OCD, what if it's not? What if it's so
Yeah. You remind
education is
me.
what it all comes down to.
Well, you remind me of a situation where I was talking with some other counselors, therapists, and
Hmm.
I was the only one who treated OCD. They didn't have any experience with OCD. And I was explaining to them a situation where I had this, I think he was middle school or maybe elementary school kid, I forget. But he had this fear. He had OCD, clear OCD. He had this fear of inappropriately touching his younger brother. And it was a fear. And he told his mom, I have this fear because it's OCD, because he would never do it, but he had a fear of
Yeah.
it, which is how OCD
Yeah.
works. And so the mom brings him to therapy. I explain it's OCD, but the other counselors I'm talking to, like, and you didn't call CPS? Like, no,
Yeah.
I don't need to call CPS. He's not going to do
In
anything.
fact, you're less likely than almost anyone else. Like studies in OCD have shown you are much less likely to do it because you are so hyper aware of not doing it.
Right. And
Yeah.
I would go so far as not to say much less likely, but you won't do it. You just
Yeah.
won't do it with
Period. Yeah.
OCD. But there was that fear there because they're taught, oh my God, mandatory reporting, mandatory reporting. And it's like,
Right. Right. Right.
imagine the harm that would have come to this family if someone from CPS, Child Protective Services, who most
Yes.
likely was not trained in OCD, comes in and starts interfering in this family who is appropriately treating a child for the appropriate illness the right way.
Yeah.
I couldn't even imagine being responsible for destroying this person's life. I'm like, absolutely not.
And it's unfortunately, I think there's more experiences like that than people that actually end up getting the right treatment. And what's tough is my family was so aware of it at such a young age that they knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case a lot of times. And the family themselves could do that to their child, or my child is having these thoughts. Um, put them in a mental hospital. And yeah,
You run into the
it,
parents who will punish the child for washing their hands too much, as an example. So every
yes.
time you wash your hands, we're going to punish you. Well,
Yeah,
imagine what that does to the kid if it's OCD.
yeah, yeah,
So, the point here being that awareness is really, really important. And you and
yes.
I were talking about awareness before, and obviously the whole purpose of doing this podcast is for awareness. But you mentioned something interesting to me that your school had done with the color teal.
Hmm.
Tell us
Yeah.
about that?
So it was actually through the IOCD Foundation, um, which I am a part of, International OCD. It's a great foundation. They're all about spreading awareness, but not only that, I'm a grassroots advocate. So they find people locally, because there's such a lack of awareness, to run these meetings, to spread knowledge about it, to give resources. And this is like real resources. Like there are few and far between therapists that have exposure therapy on their credentials. And you have access to those and can give out access. So basically identifying those that may have OCD and actually helping them.
Mm-hmm.
But they lit up, the IOCD lit up teal, different landmarks, for International OCD Day or National OCD Day. And I went and looked, and they actually had one in St. Louis, which was really cool. And it happened to be right by our campus. It was our science center. Um, and not only did it light up, but they had like QR codes and stuff you could scan, and it would tell you about the illness. And I like reading them before I share anything because a lot of media and things do not get anything right about OCD, or they're very vague.
Mhm.
But they had really good sources on there and really good resources. So I know some of my professors in the psychology and neuroscience program are always looking for extra credit opportunities to give to students. So I was like, hey, this is a really good thing that's going on. And I think it was for like 3 days they did it, just because it gave people the opportunity. And I went the first night, checked it out. There were actually a lot of people there, which I was really happy about. But also shows there's a lot more people that are probably struggling with this
Mhm.
than we know.
Mhm.
Um, and they shared it with a couple of my classes, and students wanting extra credit went and then wrote a little reflection about it. And I didn't, since I proposed it, I obviously didn't really write a reflection about it, but I got to hear some of them. And it was just baffling how much people did not know, and how much just like that small, I guess, blip of information and just getting that like taught them. Like they went and they were like, it was like, what did you think OCD was? Um, what was this experience like for you? Do you know, how did this change anything? And um students in my class that have been studying neuroscience, psychology for 3, 4, even TAs that are in grad school studying this in abnormal psychology, whatnot, we're just writing things like, oh, like I had no idea this was an actual diagnosis, or we learned about this briefly, but I thought it was a personality trait. Like it was crazy to think about um how like tough it must be living with it, just things like that. And that really showed me like it's unfortunately hard to get the word out, but like if people just had a little bit more information given out to them and the general public, especially in a university system, especially in psychology programs all over, because I know this isn't a problem with just our university or just our area. This is a huge issue.
Oh, yeah.
Then it's crazy how different they see things. And I've had friends for life that have roommates as well. My previous roommate, she lived with me for a long time. Um, and ones that are really just accepting and really want to know about it and have like seen it in me, and they're really good at explaining it to people, but it like that's kind of all you get is if somebody knows somebody that's had it and it's very visible,
Right.
or they're really open about it like I am. But otherwise it's just like, here's the DSM criteria for this diagnosis. This is my abnormal psychology class, which it was great, but that's how it is with a lot of rare mental illnesses in general. But OCD is one that I really, really am passionate about, obviously, because I have it. But here's the
Mhm.
DSM criteria for this. These people tend to be perfectionists, they're very organized. Here's these subtypes. Do you guys have any questions? Next slide. And then we do 3 weeks of depression and a week of generalized anxiety disorder. And here's a bunch of resources if you guys ever have any mental health things come up. This is who you should talk to. Here's our counseling center. Here's this. And I'm like, this is great for the general public, for people that aren't facing OCD and these, not even, I wouldn't say rare, like it's more relevant and prevalent than we think,
Mhm.
but we never diagnose it. And when we do, it's incorrect or nobody knows about it. And there's this an even worse stigma. I guess this is an unpopular opinion, but I think since all this media and suicide awareness, mental health awareness stuff has been spread, it's almost isolated me more as being someone that struggled with OCD, because these things are so in your face now, and it's great for those that can actually benefit for that. But for me, if I take those resources, which I have, I'm not just saying this, and
Mhm.
go and tell them that I'm struggling, I've had OCD, it it does not help. And that's even more isolating because you're not getting help you need in places that say they have the help you need.
Right, right.
Yeah.
That's you're highlighting a very, very important point, which is, we need to be better about teaching counselors, first responders, others about OCD so that they at least know how to recognize it. Right now they don't even know how to recognize it, and at least get to that first step.
Yeah.
So, I really have to, applaud you for being willing to share your story and tell us what it's really like to be living with OCD and the experiences you went through and the misdiagnosis and all the things that you had to work through throughout your life. And so one question for you is this: if somebody's watching this video and they're starting to recognize some OCD in themselves and that they never really knew what it was, and now it's like, yeah, I did that too. Yeah, that's me. What do you recommend that they do?
Yeah. So my parents did all the legwork, which kudos to them. I would never be where I am right now in college successful. But if you are starting to see tendencies in yourself or even potentially think that it could be OCD, the first thing I would recommend is support groups. And I don't mean just like basic mental health support groups, because you can find specific to OCD support groups. And me being in some of them myself, you go on and there are countless people who join and they're like, won't say anything for a while, and we'll be all sharing our experience, how we figured out kind of what I've shared with you today. Um, and then it'll come to them and they'll be like, I don't have OCD, but I do this. And we're like, yeah, you may have OCD. So I think that's the first step to kind of, it's not even like finding a support group, and you can find those like International OCD Foundation, and they have a ton locally because I'm from Colorado and there were so many there. And then they have a bunch in St. Louis too. I'm a grassroots advocate, like I said, for one here. But first step would be that. Second step, I would say do all the research you can, because there, even though we're not aware of it, there are people that are very aware of it. There are people that study it. There are people that focus on it. People like you who want to raise awareness about it. There's podcasts like this. Um, I think for me, even just having the diagnosis, not understanding it, um, finding resources that are specific to OCD, um, was extremely helpful. And then those specifically will give you a lot of therapy recommendations, places to go. It's really tough. I think one of the biggest things is financial access to exposure therapy and specific treatments, because I can go in and use my insurance and get unlimited or 30 sessions with a counselor, but that doesn't apply to the type of therapy I'm doing for my OCD. And unfortunately, it won't help. So the resources that are shoved in your face,
Hmm.
if you're using those and they aren't working, then don't be discouraged. Do your own research, and there are places that have really amazing support systems and therapy techniques. And I have engaged in a lot of those, and that has ultimately led me to where I am. Um, yeah,
Well,
that's my biggest advice.
yeah, and I appreciate that. I'm going to reiterate what you said. If you go to the website of iocdf.org, that's the International OCD Foundation, you can find lists of OCD providers who actually are trained and knowledgeable about OCD. You can find support groups. You can find a ton of information that is going to be credible information about OCD. So it's really a great resource for all sorts of things. The more you dig in, they have more and more and more. So it's
Yeah.
a wonderful organization with great resources. So, Laelle, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join me and to talk about this. It's so important, as you know, because you're living it. And for anybody who's watching this, I encourage you, check it out, iocdf.org. Look up the resources. If you think it applies to you, get checked. It can't hurt. The worst that could
It
happen is
definitely can't hurt.
yeah. So, all right. Well, we're gonna wrap up this podcast today. Again, thank you. Glad to have you. Always good to see you, and I wish you success as you continue your education.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.